The bloc of 5 emerging economies, known as BRICS, has held its 14th annual meeting in Beijing. Some of the topics that were brought up by the leaders of these 5 countries, which collectively account for 40% of the global population, were creating an international reserve currency, opposing hegemonic practices, and selfish international sanctions. In this edition of The Spotlight, together with our panelists, we'll examine the significance of this alliance amidst the Ukraine war, sour China-US relations, and rising energy and food prices. Joining us in this edition of The Spotlight, we have Daniel Lazar, a journalist and author from New York, and also John Bosnich, an activist and political analyst from Arad, Romania. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us in this edition of The Spotlight. If I can start with John Bosnich. Now, what is the significance of the BRICS alliance in the face of the current global developments, especially the war in Ukraine and the U.S.-led sanctions against China and Russia?
Well, I think that we're now seeing the very realistic and practical importance of BRICS as an economic alliance. The attempt by the West to sanction Russia and cut off their trade and their actual ability to function as a state has actually failed now. And the support for Russia's economy from the BRICS nations has turned out to be essential. This shows the long-term planning on the Russian side to develop an alternative to the North American free trade region and the EU. What has happened here is that Russia has actually turned the tables on the Western sanctions.
Now, crossing over to Daniel Lazar. Daniel, I want to know if you also share John Bosnich's view, because we know that after the war in Ukraine, the West has been relentlessly trying to isolate Russia. And despite this, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that trade between Russia and the BRICS member countries increased by 38%. To reach $45 billion in the first 3 months of 2022. Now, do you think that Russia really has turned the tables? And also, how important BRICS can prove to be for Russia in countering such isolating measures?
Well, those are all very interesting, very important, and very difficult questions. I think that, first of all, the international situation is in a real shambles. There's no doubt that the sanctions strategy has backfired. The U.S. gravely miscalculated, and it has wound up shooting itself in its own foot due to these totally ill-conceived sanctions it's applied on Russia. I think inflation is a huge factor, which is has added to the strength of countries that, like Russia, which export grain, energy, phosphate fertilizers, et cetera, all of which are rising very strongly in price. And there's also the war itself, which is not going well from a Western point of view. Russia, after a weak initial performance, Russia has gained the edge militarily. There's no doubt the Ukraine is on the defensive. Russia is gaining ground slowly but surely. So the result is really a double setback for the U.S. and its allies, which has created an opening for other countries in the world, China, for example, India, Brazil, et cetera, which comprise the BRICS coalition. But I'm not really sure how much of the credit goes to BRICS itself, or how much is due to the breakdown in the U.S.-led international economic structure.
Very great. John Bosnich, what do you think about what Daniel just said? To what extent do you think BRICS has been essential in helping Russia turn the tables?
Well, I agree with Mr. Lazar that, in fact, the test is going to be over the next month, 2 months, 3 months, as the full changeover of the Russian economy's basic needs provisions is completed. I'm optimistic because I know that the Russian government has spent a lot of time planning for these eventualities and is expecting even further sanctions to be imposed from the Western powers on other BRICS countries to try and inhibit BRICS support for Russia. But I don't think that those sanctions will work. I think the world has actually come to a critical historic turning point in this conflict in Ukraine, and we're seeing the beginning of the end of the Anglo-American empire of war and takeovers. So I'm relatively optimistic because I know that the resources of the BRICS countries, if delivered at the right time and at the right place, can change the entire balance of world power.
Let's just discuss that a little bit further with Daniel. So now we are talking about an emerging new world order after the war in Ukraine and the U.S. losing ground. I want to point to this fact that none of the BRICS nations has spoken out against Russia's war in Ukraine. And they have also ignored Western sanctions on Russia. Actually, China and India have both ramped up crude oil imports from Russia, helping to offset losses from Western nations scaling back Russian energy purchases. Now, do you think that the West has actually shot itself in the foot by sanctioning Russia and underestimating the importance of alliances such as BRICS?
Yeah, oh, definitely. No doubt about it. I mean, the U.S. foreign policy is completely incoherent. It has, there's one rule for America, a second set of rules for Europe, and a third set of rules for all the countries that America doesn't like. And unfortunately, that third category now includes, a majority of the countries in the world, which are, which have been hit with U.S. sanctions, various kinds of U.S. censure. They've been penalized by U.S. policy, and therefore they are in no mood at all to go along with U.S. sanctions against Russia. So the U.S. has really overplayed its hands, and as a consequence, it's lost control of the global situation. So, but the thing about BRICS is that BRICS is a very diverse group. I mean, it includes, Brazil, headed by Jair Bolsonaro, a far right winger. It includes the Modi government in India, which is Hindu fundamentalist. It includes South Africa, which is racked by profound corruption crises. So it's a very diverse group. It has troubles of its own. And I think that the old order is definitely collapsing. I'm not sure what's arising in its place, and I'm not sure exactly what role the BRICS nations are playing.
Okay. John, over to you. What do you think about the U.S. being incoherent and overplaying its hand?
I usually agree with Daniel Lazar, and again, I agree with him to the letter. The fact of the matter is that America and its allies in England are suffering from a delusion of invincibility. They are deluding themselves, thinking that they can do, as they did in the past, whatever they wanted. They changed the government of Iran several times. They changed governments all around the world. They changed the government of Yugoslavia. They've brought down governments in Ukraine. They've put up governments in other countries. And they just believed that they could do whatever they wanted. They pick the candidates. They decide which ministries will be controlled by who. They will determine which parties get into parliament. They even pick the ministry sub-ministers. And finally, this had to come to an end somewhere, and no better place than Ukraine. That's the same place where Hitler's armies ended their reign of terror and met the opposition that they met from Russia in the fields of Ukraine. And I think it's fitting that NATO goes the same way as the Nazis went, down the tubes.
Right. Daniel, you're a little bit skeptical about the importance of BRICS, apparently. The BRICS wants to actually soon go a step further by challenging the U.S. dollar, creating its own international reserve currency. based on the basket of currencies of our other countries involved, the other nations. So can this move change your opinion about the importance of BRICS?
Well, if it's successful, it certainly will, no doubt about it. If they're able to do that, if they're really able to create a currency which competes with the dollar in an effective way, then yeah, I'll be quite impressed. I mean, I just think that BRICS is I mean, they're just a very disparate group with very little in common, except that they really they have run out of patience with clumsy but overbearing U.S. Global domination. And that, I think, is totally understandable. It's totally welcome. I'm glad that it's finally happening. But whether the BRICS have enough internal coherence to put together any kind of new world order, I just really very much doubt that. But I think things are changing dramatically, and I really think that the U.S. global structure is really rapidly unwinding. It's a very important development.
John, how do you view BRICS introducing its own international reserve currency? Is that going to be that slap in the face of the dollar?
Well, I've spent considerable time in several of the BRICS countries, and I'm aware of the fact that China in particular has already got a currency that's covering roughly 1/4 of the world population. The expansion of connections between China and India, despite their local and regional issues, has been positive. There is increasing trade there, and I believe that as Russia turns its economy toward these two major powers on its borders, and as we see growing individual countries within BRICS recognizing that their resources are threatened by the Anglo-American imperial sort of policy of just take and just looting other countries, I think we're going to see a major change in the way this world is run. And I agree with Daniel here that the BRICS structures have not been tested, but I see BRICS as a template or an infrastructure for the building of an economic system. And the best way for any economic system to work is on a common currency. Now that we've seen Russia tie its ruble to the gold, to actually be able to exchange rubles for gold, we've seen the development of a totally stable, unquestionable currency, which has been just climbing every day against the dollar and against the euro, both of which are just fiat currencies printed on what I call toilet paper. There is no doubt that a gold-backed standard, backed by the economic and united with the economic power and consumer population of China and India, must be stronger than a dollar that's literally backed by nothing other than the military-industrial complex of the United States.
Thank you. Daniel, we know that these 5 emerging economies account for 40% of the global population, but it's not about the population alone. Actually, all these 5 countries are resource-rich countries. And one thing that the war in Ukraine, I guess, showed the world is that the world is still reliant on natural resources, just as much as it probably is reliant on technology. Now, do you think this will give the BRICS any advantage in the current situation?
It will, but it definitely will. But I think the importance of natural resources, it's caused not so much by the war, but by inflation. The war has definitely aggravated inflation, but inflation, we all know, was growing before the war began. But inflation is not permanent. The central banks in the West are now cracking down, raising interest rates in the hope of essentially defeating inflation. It'll be at the expense of causing a deep recession in their own countries. So in a certain sense, they have a gun pointed to their own head, and they're pulling the trigger. So they're gonna greatly weaken their own economies in order to strengthen their currencies and to defeat inflation. But if they are successful in defeating inflation by whatever means, then that could very easily undo the advantage that now accrues to the commodity producers. So things are looking really good for for grain exporters, energy exporters, et cetera. But that could change very easily. We've seen in the 80s, for example, the mid 80s, oil prices plunged dramatically. And the Saudi economy, for example, was just flat on its back. The commodities boom again broke in, I think, 2013 or 14, and Brazil was really hard hit by that as well. And so inflation is a temporary phenomenon. And I think that I wouldn't overdo the advantages that are flowing to the BRICS countries as a consequence.
All right. John, what do you think? Do you also believe
Well,
that these can change, as Daniel put it?
well, as Daniel said correctly, inflation is a temporary phenomenon, but the control levers on the inflationary problems being faced in the West are not all in the hands of the West. We are seeing that the fuel supply is going up and up and up in price every single day. And we've got to remember, who is the fuel coming from? Venezuela was the country that the United States wanted to conduct a coup d'etat and place their own people in power. We've got Saudi Arabia, which is under pressure in a war situation. We've got your own production in Iran being sanctioned by the United States. We've got China offering to buy up Russia's entire production, and India helping with that. So we're actually seeing the United States and the Western economies being cut out of some of their fundamental suppliers. And if they do not have access at a good price for the essential energy and food, because we've got a problem now with wheat coming out of Ukraine, if these two problems coalesce, then we can really see hyperinflation in the United States, and hyperinflation would mean a complete collapse of the US economy. If that's coupled with a military loss, then we're seeing the essential elements of an empire collapse. And that's what Russia appears to be aiming for. And this was not provoked by Russia. This is a Russian response to a bridge too far, an attack too far, a takeover too far by the Anglo-American empire, not planned out in advance, picking the wrong people to work with. I mean, working with neo-Nazis wearing swastikas is just a bad way to go.
Okay, Daniel, another bone of contention is Taiwan. China, has been at odds with the U.S. over Taiwan. So does China want BRICS to gain influence on the international stage as a counterbalance to the U.S. hegemony?
Oh yeah, undoubtedly. Yeah, I mean, Taiwan is a major flashpoint. There are lots of flashpoints around the world. I mean that's that's due to the fact that the U.S. empire is coming undone. The Persian Gulf is a flashpoint, a very important flashpoint. Now that the JCPOA talks seem to be nearing an end and seem to be ending unsatisfactorily. So a lot of things could go wrong. There are a lot of blowups waiting in the wings. Lithuania, I mean, who thought about Lithuania a week ago as a potential, a potential source of conflict? But now the crisis that the Lithuanian government has caused is a very serious one and could lead to a dramatic extension of the war in the Ukraine. So everyone is preparing. Everyone's aware that there are all kinds of time bombs set to go off. Everybody's looking for support, and everybody is jockeying for advantage. So certainly China is looking to curry support among the BRICS nations and other nations in terms of its policy towards Taiwan, and the U.S., as usual, is behaving in a very provocative and very reckless manner. And if that triggers a war, which it very possibly could, I'm sure that'll essentially redound to the disadvantage of the U.S. as well.
John, I want you to first react to what Daniel just said, and after that, I want you to tell me what you think about the sanctions, because one key thing that both Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin stressed at the meeting was countering illegal unilateral sanctions and selfish actions from the West. What other measures do you think the BRICS nations can take in order to counter such illegal sanctions?
Well, first of all, to go back to Daniel Lazar's remarks, I agree completely, and I think he's picked the word of today's discussion, which is recklessness. I think he's hit it exactly on the nail. This is what America has been doing, and their recklessness has reached such a high level now that they literally rolled the dice without calculating the odds. And if any of the suppliers that are keeping America's economy afloat, for example, Venezuela, if Venezuela were to put sanctions on the United States and cut off the supply of oil products to the United States, that would throw inflation up into the 15% level immediately within 2 weeks. And this would be a crisis of proportions that would force America to go to war on a new front against Venezuela or against another oil supplier. So all the cards are sitting in the hands of the BRICS nations. The Americans, guided by their Anglo advisors, have put themselves in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Their aggressive saber rattling towards Iran, the same saber rattling towards Venezuela, and now having pushed the situation with Taiwan and China to the brink, they face the possibility of a multi-front war. They face the possibility of seeing Taiwan collapse without even a fight. They see the possibility of losing the entire access to the seashore along the Black Sea from the Ukrainian side. And they see the potential of a Russian pipeline going straight across what's now being called Novorossiya, southern part of former Ukraine, directly into Romania and on to the rest of Europe without any reference to Kiev. This is the worst situation that America has faced since World War II.
Gentlemen, a pleasure to have you both on Press TV. Thank you so much for joining us. I've been talking to Daniel Lazar, a journalist and author joining us from New York, and John Bosnich, an activist, political analyst, and a journalist joining us from Arad, Romania. And thank you so much for watching this edition of The Spotlight.